Thank you, Rory, and good to see you all here. So, as Rory said, my name is Lynn Rees. I'm a Palawa woman descending from the Trawlwoolway people of North East Tasmania and convicts from the Cambridgeshire region in England. I also pay my respects to country, and I will say it in language, but this is what it roughly translates to. There's not really a direct translation from a lot of Aboriginal languages to English because they're concept-based. So this is roughly what I'm saying. So, Nalanika, Mukunika, Warankalinika, Nuyinanika, Warantatakara, Eastern Kulin, Miletina Nikatu, Nina Manamarapali, Nuyina Manamapali, Warantakara, Tunapri. Sorry, got lost in the middle there. So roughly translates to this earth, this sea, this sky, these ancestors. We stand on Eastern Kulin country, or in this context, we stand on Wurundjeri Woiwurrung country, and with our eyes and with our ears and with our spirit, we learn. An acknowledgement, the way that I like to think of an acknowledgement is actually in response to a welcome. So the country that we're on right now and the neighbouring countries use the word Wominjeka when they welcome you to country. And that means welcome, come, but what is your purpose for being here? So it's an invitation, but it's with a declaration of intent. So a lot of the way I like to think about an acknowledgement is a response to that. So acknowledging the country on, who the traditional custodians are, that sovereignty has never been ceded, and that your intention is good, or that your intention is tied to the purpose of what you're doing this evening. So for me, my intention is pretty much always to Indigenise the built environment in pretty much everything I do. And I have the good fortune of being at a practice who is leading in this space and also working at Monash University and sitting on a number of advisory boards as well. So thank you for having me. So I'm going to focus this lecture on the idea that you are about to graduate, as Rory has said, and that you're graduating at a time that is, I guess, in the middle of a change. Our industry is changing quite significantly for better outcomes for country, culture and community. And one of those big changes is that the National Standards of Competency, which is a document which governs what architecture schools have to teach, what you have to prove when you do your registration exams, and what your continuing professional development is based on when you get into the profession. So that's been updated, and by the time you all register, if you plan to register in Australia, then you will need to, there are 8 new performance criteria which are Indigenous specific, which is about understanding country, your responsibility to country, what engagement processes are, and a whole lot of nuance around cultural authority and intellectual property from an Indigenous perspective. So what I'm going to focus on tonight is not actually projects. I'm going to talk about what this means for you guys who are graduating very soon, going into the workforce, where you may or may not have the opportunity to work on projects that engage with traditional custodians. So this is about how you actually develop your own understanding so that when you do come to register, you will have you'll have experience or enough knowledge in order to do so. So this always comes back to the point of you are responsible for your actions towards country. So every line we draw on a piece of paper, every mark we make becomes a manifestation in real life when we do real projects. And even when we're doing ones that are for studio, we need to be cognizant of the fact that where we site a building might impact the way that water flows across the land. It might impact the way insects can communicate with each other, or how trees communicate underground. All of these Indigenous concepts that are probably not something that you've learnt so far, but something that you will need to learn to educate yourself with as you go into the next few years. So why? This is the ethos that we have at JCB in relation to our actions towards country. One, obviously with the intention of Indigenising the built environment, is understanding that every single project that we work on in Australia is within an Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander country. So every single project we do impacts country. We can't remove ourselves from that. That is the fundamental reality. The other fundamental reality is that architecture and planning are 2 of the industries most complicit in the colonisation of country, so the destruction of place. We have to acknowledge that up front, and we have to be aware that the actions of our colleagues of the past have caused harm, and our responsibility is to not continue with business as usual and actually step towards a future that looks to repair and celebrate country. So our options really are destroy, and most of the projects that are happening right now are continuing to destroy country. The next step is to maintain, so the status quo of that country, the health of that country in its current context, and that could be a good or bad thing depending on the state of the health of that country. Repair, In most cases, this is where we'd like to aim for as a first step, and then celebrate. So celebrate really means that once we've understood country, we know that country's healthy, we can then actually celebrate that country, and you will be invited into those cultural processes and understandings through the journey of creating a place that is celebrated. Most of our, as I said, most projects are still in the destroy end of the category, but we really need to start at the very least at maintain, which means actually understanding the health and wellbeing of the site that we're on, and then taking actions towards repair and celebrate. How? So I'm going to go through a series of protocols or processes that you can use, which are, in the first instance, introspective. So they're about you, your own understanding, and your relationship with the country that you're on. They're not about engaging with traditional custodians or anything like that yet. It starts with you. So the first step is actually knowing who you are and where you come from. So the reason that this exists is because when you're going to engage with country or when you're going to engage with traditional custodians, you're going to be asking them to share a lot about themselves, their cultural understanding, their identity, their relationship with place. And in order for you to be able to hear that, you need to actually know who you are, where you come from, what you believe in, why you believe in it, what are your values, so that you can either remove yourself from a scenario where you feel your bias is impeding your ability to listen, or you can understand when you can relate to something and you have a common relationship or a common understanding of something. These things are really important. But being able to remove your own bias and suspend your own understanding of something in order to listen and take something else in is a very important practice. Because if you grew up here, you've spent the last, however old you are, years probably, going through an education system that hasn't taught you anything about the countries that you're living on and within. So we all have to go through this unlearning process and relearning process, which is quite often called decolonisation. But it's not something that you can necessarily just be told. It's something that you have to question in yourself all the time. Why do I believe this? Why is this a thing that I have, is the default position in my mind? Did I make that decision for myself, or did I learn that behaviour? If I learnt it, where did I learn it from? Now that I am an adult, do I still believe it? And come up with your own informed opinion and your own informed understanding of the world. Then it's know whose country you're on. So Rory acknowledged that we're on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country. Knowing how to find that out, it's actually quite easy. If you've used VicPam before in Victoria, that there is a layer and a category for traditional custodians, so you can seek that out. I would note that it doesn't represent everyone and there are some conflicts. So it's a good thing to keep coming back to that map just to keep up to date with what all the latest resolutions are, because to have a registered Aboriginal party or native title is a lengthy legal process. So there are a number of Aboriginal groups going through that process right now. So point 3 is to educate yourself with Indigenous perspectives. I've put this slide up as closing the non-Indigenous gap. You may have heard in the media over time this concept of closing the gap, which is a government measure intended to close the death age gap between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people, but the markers are usually Western markers for success. So education, health, housing. There's nothing about connection to country, connection to culture, the things that actually sustain Aboriginal people, the things that Aboriginal people have been removed from over the course of colonisation with intent by the government. So it is actually your responsibility to educate yourself. If you're going to live here, if you're going to fundamentally reshape the lands through your work, then it is your responsibility. And my suggestion is to do that with Indigenous perspectives and a broad range of Indigenous perspectives, because we have over 400 or more different language groups in Australia. Every language group has a different value set, different protocols, different systems. Yes, there are similarities across them, but you need to understand that the way we might work on Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung country is different to how we might work on Dja Dja Wurrung country, which is only 100 kilometres away, but it's different. And the way we might work in Central Desert or at the top end will be different again. There are different ways of working, different ways of relating to country, different ways of understanding space. So research broad and wide, but really key into those Indigenous perspectives, because most of the non-Indigenous perspectives, not all, but most, are based on anthropological understandings and readings that were taken early during colonisation. So they are typically white male anthropologists who see the world through a white male lens and predominantly have only told black male stories and not black women's stories. So there is an imbalance even in the histories and the anthropological histories of our country. So it's important that you listen to people now and you listen to a broad range of people. Interactive. Anybody know what any of these things are? Any of these events or processes are? Yep. Yep. That's good. Yes, very good. That is way more than I normally get when I have this. Well done. So these are but a grain of salt in or a grain of sand rather, in a beach worth of events that have actually happened over the last 180 years, 200 years, 180 in Victoria, or just over, 188 I think. And these are all processes that Aboriginal people have gone through, and this is why it's important to understand these histories and the truths of these histories, because it does give you an understanding and a perspective of the relationships that you might have, the distrust that might exist between government and Aboriginal people, the kinds of encounters that you might have if you then go on to work with traditional custodians on projects. So yes, there's the flag raising. Yes, there's taking Aboriginal children from their families to effectively remove them and put them into white homes in order to stop them learning about their own culture and their own language. There is the breeding out the black policy, which is a policy related to the idea that Aboriginal people don't have a recessive gene for melanin, so we will never have a throwback to being dark-skinned like you might in Black American culture, or Black American, you know what I mean. So there was a policy literally about breeding Aboriginal people with non-Aboriginal people, and over time that would mean that they would literally breed out the black of our skin. We had concentration camps, we had the White Australia policy until the 1970s, so not that long ago. And yes, then we've had other forms of resistance, the freedom rides, the tent embassy, both are really important in our history. The apology, unfortunately, they're still taking away more children now than they were at the time that they apologised for, so I don't know what that means. And the intervention, which happened not that long ago, maybe a decade or more, where the Army occupied the Northern Territory Aboriginal communities and took ownership of their land on 44 or 99-year leases for reasons, under the guise of pedophilia rings, which have proven to not exist, but those occupation and ownerships of those lands still exist. There's a lot of things that have happened. There's a lot of positive things and a lot of negative things. There's a lot more than what I've said, but what I want you to understand is that the relationship and the trust between a lot of Aboriginal communities and institutions and organisations isn't good. And you have to be a genuine person if you're going to enter into this space. You need to know who you are, where you come from, what you value, because you're going to be tested. Because we're testing everybody else all the time with the work that we do. Understand the way that knowledge works. So in a Western context, you can access any information you want ever in any way, shape or form. It is available to you online unless it's top secret. It's pretty much you can access whatever you want, learn whatever you want, read whatever paper you want. In an Indigenous context, it's completely different. You earn knowledge, and you earn it once you are deemed trustworthy enough to retain it, remember it, and then know how to tell it, and know when to tell it, and know how and when to pass it on to the next generation, if that is the responsibility that's given to you. When working on projects, you might hear parts of knowledge or parts of information or science, Indigenous science in that context. You'll never hear it all. Very rarely will you hear it all. And that's okay, because that's about protecting that knowledge, because in the past, that knowledge has been taken and misunderstood and misinterpreted. So you need to be a trustworthy person. You need to be genuine. You need to understand what your intentions are and make sure that they are good. Otherwise, don't work in the space. Leading into the next point, which is be introspective, so question your own motivations and intent. If you want to have a bit of a snapshot, this is architecture, when architecture has been used as a form of colonisation. So these are different housing typologies that have been constructed in the Northern Territory from the 1950s onwards, starting with sort of one room, not insulated tin sheds, all the way up to sort of what we have now, which is Besser block, no eaves, middle of the desert construction. None of these, the reason that I'm bringing this slide up and the reason that I want to couch this in the context of questioning your own motivation and intent is because if someone actually took the time to question why they were creating more houses and what the need was, we wouldn't have housing like this, we wouldn't have these conditions in remote communities. The basis of overcrowding, which is a term you might have heard if you've ever looked up Aboriginal housing in remote communities, is based on Canadian standards of occupancy, which is based on a nuclear family model of one mother, one father, and 2 children. And the notion that once children are past puberty, they should have their own bedrooms. It is not the way that family groups work in these remote communities. And so all of these houses are built and they're not fit for purpose culturally, and they're not fit for purpose even merely in the simplest form of size, given that a lot of people are transitory between houses and a lot of family groups actually share a space rather than having their own individual space. That varies across the country. This is a condition particularly in the Northern Territory and a bit of WA, but we're still doing this. These houses are still getting built. We're still colonising the ways that families, the way that we think families should be, according to the government, and building these structures. The next point is be fearless. I know I've said a lot of things that sound probably scary, but you know, this is an illustration of 60,000+ years, or as long as science can prove. That is the black line. The little circle over here is the year 0. And this is how long we've had a shared history on this country. So there are thousands of generations of knowledge, and if you're willing to be a genuine person and engage in this space, we'll be able to create a better future for everyone. Eliminate elitism, expectation, and ego in the negative sense. You've probably seen this diagram before. I hope you have. In the Western context, we sort of, well, it's slightly changing, but tend to see the human at the top of the food chain in this pyramid context, whereas in an Indigenous context, it's more aligned with the diagram on the right, where we understand that we're part of a network, we're part of a system. We aren't the dominator. Actually, we need to work in relationship with everything else, otherwise we won't survive. I don't know if that's hard to read, but build relationships. So actually engaging and with Aboriginal people when you feel that you are culturally responsible enough to do so. And just never say any of these things, please, to any of them. It's an artwork that was done by Pierre Van Sparks, and when I first saw it, I was sitting with some friends of mine, Aboriginal friends of mine, and we were like, oh, that was pretty easy to get bingo. So it's really easy to do. So just take the time to understand what's inappropriate to say. I'm happy to share this slide if you want to look at it further. The next question, and back to architecture, is who are you designing for? So in most contexts, we have a client, a stakeholder, an end user. Sometimes you just have a client. Sometimes you have a client and a stakeholder, end user. Sometimes you also have traditional custodians. They don't sit within the context of stakeholder, because a stakeholder is someone who has an interest. A traditional custodian is someone who can speak on behalf of country. It's a very different relationship. But effectively, on one end, you might have projects that have an Indigenous client, an Indigenous stakeholder, and an Indigenous end user. Or the other end, and more commonly, a non-Indigenous client, non-Indigenous stakeholder, non-Indigenous end user. So every project exists on this spectrum, and it is our responsibility to design for these people. But quite often, you don't see the intent behind the brief, why it's been written the way it has, and what's been left out, which more often than not is country. So country should also be our client and who we work with in partnership. So this comes to the question of what are the values that are driving decision making? I don't know if you've ever seen this. I find it quite depressing. These are Australia's values. I'll read a few out. Respect and freedom and dignity for the individual, freedom of religion, including the freedom not to follow a particular religion, freedom of speech and freedom of association, commitment to the rule of law, which means that all people are subject to law and should obey it, parliamentary democracy, etc., etc. If you take the time to read through all of these, they're all about people and they're all about the individual. So I think cheekily about 4 years ago or so, I decided to do a markup for country. This is just my perspective. It's not been engaged with anybody else. But how would we change these values if we actually put country at the centre of them, or country at least is equal to people? How would that change the way that we see the world and how we want to operate within it? So respect and freedom and dignity for all elements and systems that make up country, which includes us. We are part of that system in our place in it. This is a question that I ask my students, and I honestly think it takes us about, I always think it'll take a week, and it takes about 3 to actually ask the students to go and think about what it is that they value and why they value it, and do they still agree with it. I think this is an important task, and I think it should happen in architecture school, but if it's not, I would encourage you to go and do it for yourself. So now more about the kind of questions you might ask yourself or you might ask of your project. So, for example, who am I, where do I come from, and what is my purpose for being here? So back again to the beginning of the acknowledgement and stating of intent. How do I see myself reflected in this environment, and how do other people see themselves reflected in this environment? So this is about understanding how you actually connect to country yourself. You're allowed to have a connection to country, that is totally fine. It's encouraged actually, because if you develop that relationship, then you have a greater respect for it and it doesn't become this alien thing. But importantly, knowing that other people will see themselves reflected differently. It's kind of like if I just shouted out the word bread now and asked you to describe it to me, we'd get 47 different versions of bread. So you've got to understand that nobody has the same relationship with country at all ever. Everyone has a different relationship, and it's important to understand what they value and what's important to them. Who has the cultural authority to speak on behalf of country? So cultural authority is vested in typically the elders of a particular traditional custodian group. So we're a Wurundjeri country, it would be the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elders. The reason it's usually this way, there are exceptions, is if we go back to the diagram about the way knowledge works, it takes a lifetime to learn Aboriginal knowledge. Young people won't have that encyclopedia of information, and elders also tend to take on different responsibilities. So an elder might be the elder for language, another elder might be the elder for land management or fire burning practices. In much the same way as we all have our professions, different elders hold different aspects of knowledge. So it's important to understand who you're talking to and understanding what authority they have to speak on behalf of that thing, because typically, again, not always, different elders will be able to speak to different things, and nobody will want to speak on behalf of somebody else's knowledge. I don't have any cultural authority to speak on behalf of this country. I'm not from here. My ancestors are from the north of Tasmania. I have never grown up on my own country. I wouldn't dare to claim that I have the cultural authority to speak on its behalf. I am like many young Aboriginal people who have not grown up with, or many actually Aboriginal people alive today who have not grown up with the connection to the country that they're from. So that is a reality for many of us. And many of us actually end up having this sort of, I guess, Australia-wide understanding of indigeneity because of that. What is country? Anyone know the answer? Yeah, well, I mean, the reality is that, as I said before, everyone's got a different relationship with country, so everyone's going to have a different definition of country. How I describe country is everything that you can see and everything that you can't see in a holistic environment. So you have the tangible aspects of country, the things that you can read, and then you have the intangibles, the systems that you can't necessarily understand or see in totality, but you know are connected. And we have the capacity to actually understand at least part of those in the way that we research our sites and the way that we understand the countries that we work on, which I'll get to in a little bit if you're interested. Probably the better question, actually, instead of what is country, is who is country, because country is usually given personhood or the equivalent of pronouns in that context, and it tends to be feminine. And this is actually not that different from a Western context where you say Mother Earth, right? It's country, she, her. It's the same kind of concept. Who is country to those who hold the right to speak on its behalf? So who is country to the traditional custodians who hold the cultural authority to speak on behalf of country? That is something that you would understand through an engagement process with traditional custodians. But I would also encourage you to look up senior elders giving welcomes to country, which might be recorded and on YouTube, because quite often in those recordings, they will tell you what the values, rights and laws of country are and what your responsibility is when you're working or operating in this place. And it's important to know. So what are the tangible aspects of country's identity that we can see? So in our work, in Victoria, actually, we're quite lucky. We have a lot of information and databases and mapping resources that we can draw from to understand what I tend to refer to as before country. So before meaning before planning and architecture, minimise the agency of country, or minimise the agency of country. So what we're trying to do really through our work is to give that agency back to country by giving agency a voice through the process. So you can understand what the pre-1750 flora of a site would be. You can use resources like NatureKit. You can understand what the geology below our feet is. You can use things like GeoVic or Yarra Atlas. You can understand what waterways exist and existed, both through places like Yarra Atlas and also through NatureKit, because various EVCs, ecological vegetation classes, are water-based, so brackish wetlands, swamps, all those sorts of things. You can use resources like PROV Map Warper, and you can look at historical maps all the way from sort of the 1830s up until now that have been digitised. And some of those really early maps give you great clues as to the identity of place. And when I say the identity of place, I mean the tangible things that you can see. So, I mean, there's many, many, many more resources, but those ones are a good place to start. And the idea of this is to build a picture and understanding of who country was, the identity of country, the visual identity of country, before destruction happened. Because if you can get to know that version of country and you can get to know the version of country we have now, you can understand the difference, you can understand the status of health, and you can understand and have a starting point as to where you might go towards. We're never going to go completely back to where we were. That's just not going to happen. And it's not even really the intent. It's more about understanding, okay, how can we make this place healthier? How can we make country healthier? You can also understand what animal species occupy a place. You can use the Atlas of Living Australia and look at all the records of anybody that's ever recorded a sighting of a particular animal species, and then it will break it down as to whether it's native or not. You can see their occupation across the whole country, their migration paths. You can find all of this information out, because it's not just the plants and animals the plants that were ripped out of country and the waterways fundamentally changed. It's also the habitats of all of the animal species, our animal kin, our insects that have been relocated or dispossessed or killed through the process of colonisation. So understanding that we actually have the power to bring those back, we actually have the power to reintroduce habitats. Our architectures can be architectures for animals, not just for humans. I think that makes it exciting. It's not just about humans. What are the tangible aspects of country's identity that we can't see? So still tangible, but we can't see them, i.e. they have been removed. So we can build this picture of before country, and that can give us a clue as to what we really should be aiming towards, or how we might even consider materiality in the context of our project, harking back to the concepts of vernacular or a contemporary vernacular, and how that informs the way we think about what we're going to do. So what do the intangible aspects of country's identity tell us about what we can't see? So intangible is, one way of defining it is not visible or temporary. And I really encourage you the next time that Tanderrum is on, which is a performance of the 5 Aboriginal groups of the Kulin Nations come together in Fed Square, and they perform their songs and dances. And with each other as a form of exchange. And if you go, pay attention to what birds are being represented through the dances and what the markings on people's bodies are. All of these things, and even the stories that might be told or the songs that might be sung, you can analyse those and you can understand, okay, we're on a place where we should be talking about ringtail possums because they're being demonstrated through dance, but there are no ringtail possums here. So the story that's actually connected to this place and to this country is one about ringtail possums, but where are they? So you can start to interpolate the things that are missing, where the gaps in the data might exist. So the combination of Aboriginal knowledge through performance and the data that we have to build a fuller picture of an understanding of place. How is this part of country connected to, in relationship with, supported by, impacted by the areas of country around it? So unfortunately, the way that we work is that we have a cadastre system, Torrens title system, and all of our land is subdivided by dashed red lines. And our scope of works typically exists within the context of those site boundaries. But they are arbitrary, and they are something that's been made up in order for, I guess, economic or capitalism or whatever version of life you would like to call it. Whatever we do in one site is going to have an impact on its neighbouring sites and maybe even further down. We're working on a project at the moment that is actually right next to a supervolcano in Victoria, which is very exciting. And it's the very start of a watercourse that connects all the way from a couple of hours north of Melbourne into the Goulburn River, into the Murray, and then connects all of the waterways from Queensland and New South Wales, and then ends up going back out into the sea in Adelaide. Now that is an absolutely massive water system, and because we're at the very start of it, if we do something that destroys or harms that water in any way, we're harming the spirit of that water, we're harming the rights of that water, and we're harming the health of that water. So understanding where your project sits in relationship with a wider network of the systems of country is really important. So water, wind, air, rain, the water cycle, all those sorts of things. If you haven't looked up the rock cycle, I encourage it. I think I say this every time I speak. Very interesting. It gives you a really good indication of just how everything is constantly moving. Just the pace that we're actually looking at it is out of sync with our understanding of time. Okay, so how has country changed over time? Was it by design or by choice? If it was by design, then what was the intent and what were the consequences? So I find the Birrarung, the Yarra River, a really good one to explain this. A lot of the laws around and protocols around working within and across Boonwurrung and Wurundjeri country are about not harming the waterways. Now, since colonisation, we've blown up a waterfall, which is the line between freshwater and saline water, and that is right in the city. We did that collectively, so that the boats could turn around. Now that fundamentally changed the ecology. Then we built in Melbourne, and we built structures, therefore assets. We've filled in swamps, because swamps in the context of England were considered unhealthy. There was a lot of miasma around them. People got sick, probably because they didn't treat them with respect. And so they got filled in. And then we built on top of those. And then because the water can't actually go through its normal process, it can't fill out into these brackish seasonal wetlands. It can't actually connect to the billabongs that it once did when the water level rose. It can't deposit its nutrients. The river starts to flood, and flood at a level that is incompatible with the structures that we've built. Therefore, we try and control the river. We widen it, we change its path, we put solid walls, concrete walls either side of it. We underground a lot of these waterways so we can control them and they don't flood our systems and our roads. There's a giant drain underneath Elizabeth Street. If you go down to South Bank and actually look across, you can see this massive, actually there's two massive drains. That was once a river, and it's not a river anymore because it was inconvenient for people who were designing that place at that time. So we have really destroyed the health of that river over the last 180 years. So that wasn't by choice of the river, it was by design. And the intent was to protect assets and protect humans, not considering that we have all of our animal species and kin and flora and natural systems that operate in that space. So everything we do has a consequence, and it's important to understand you can't understand all of the consequences up front, unfortunately, but understanding, at least thinking through what they might be. So what are the values of country? We've talked about this a little bit before. If we give country personhood, country also has values like humans do. What are the rights of this country? So the waterway, the river that we were just talking about, has the right to flow, the right to flood, the right to be in flux, the right to be a home, the right to be healthy, the right to destroy, has all the same rights as a human does. Has the right to be in its system and be who it is. And we aren't allowing that to happen. How do we work with this country to ensure her health and well-being? So we've probably talked about all of that, but the primary importance is the health and well-being of country. You won't be able to engage with traditional custodians on every project. You won't be able to know the values, rights and laws of country on every project. You just won't. And so the default position that you should come back to or fall back on is, okay, how do I improve the health and well-being of this country, even if I can't engage? What does that mean? How do we work with country to ensure her rights and values are upheld? How can design ensure that traditional owners of this country can see themselves reflected within it? So if you ever have the opportunity to walk around with traditional custodians, one of my elders, Nawi Carolyn Briggs, we've had a lot of conversations actually about the fact that she can't see herself reflected in the built environment, and when she's saying she can't see herself reflected, she means she can't see her country, because her country is her and she is her country. And we've removed all of these markers of country, and what that does is it removes our ability to read country, which means that it removes our ability to predict what's going to happen. So when we talk about Indigenous seasons, we're talking about those markers of country that tell us something is going to happen. It might be that a certain star constellation is at a certain point in the sky at a certain level, which means, okay, now is a good time to go hunting for a certain type of food. Or it might be that you get the double ring on the moon, particularly in the Northern Territory, and that means that it's a trigger point to go and do something else. Now, those things still exist, but all of those markers about the migration of birds, because we removed their habitats, are no longer there. All of the I could go on for hours with this, so I'll stop, but you get the point. Those markers of country have been removed, so maybe we can bring them back. How can design ensure the identity and spirit of this country is seen, felt, and respected? So seen is really bringing back those visual markers, but felt and respected is something different. And this is something that we often have as a challenge from traditional owners, is to create a space where the public might come into and they can feel country. And I haven't seen a project that's done that yet. So maybe you'll be the first, maybe I'll be the first, who knows. But the importance is, if you can feel it, then you can understand it, therefore you can develop a relationship with it. I encourage you to sit on your balcony or outside your house or your apartment or in the park nearby for 5 minutes, the same place every day, and just watch and see what changes over that time. I did this during COVID. I have a balcony, and I'm just getting a reminder to do my timesheet, sorry. There was a bird that was building a nest. It was a little magpie lark. And I was watching them, and there was two of them. There was a male and a female, and they would fly over to the cemetery, pick up sort of a wet stick, and then come back. And then when they came back, the other one left, and they went in tandem like this all the time. But they only occupied that tree for the first half of the morning, and then the rainbow lorikeets came in, and then it was the ravens in the afternoon. And if you start to observe these things, you get to understand that there is actually a temporal relationship with place, and we might have a more permanent understanding of a relationship with place, but all of the animal kin and the insects around us have a temporal relationship. I've got a possum, ringtail possum, that has decided to make a home in the watering can on my balcony, and of a night time comes out and jumps into the tree next door and has his feed, or then climbs up the side of the building and goes onto the roof and plays around and then comes back, or has staring contests with my cats through the windows. And it's just so lovely to see that even in an urban context, that animal can survive. But imagine if they had a much more broad, this tree is isolated, right? If it left its tree, it'd be in risk. Imagine if it had a broad canopy of trees that it could move around country and have a wider relationship with place. I've rambled. How can the design ensure the identity of spirit of country is present in the way that all visitors understand, respect, nurture, and therefore develop a relationship with? This one can be captured in multiple ways. It sort of lends itself to tourism, but it's about education. Because we've had such the first 200 years of this place have not respected Aboriginal knowledge, we really need to, I guess, swing the pendulum really far in one direction for a while so that people can start to develop that understanding and that knowledge and that relationship with place in order for us to come back into some sort of equilibrium. I don't particularly like wayfinding and signage, but sometimes it's a way that someone might connect to a place. How can this country support cultural practices? So understanding the relationship between people and flora is not just there for the animals. Understanding when you can and can't cultivate something. Understanding that actually, if you look around you in a natural environment, there is everything you need, the food, the resources to weave and make baskets or nets to fish. Everything exists within the country that you're in. So if you can recast your understanding of these animals and these plants, particularly the plants, not just as ornament, not just as something nice to look at, but actually as a resource and actually as a home. How should this country be cared for? So this is really about land management practices and understanding what they are. If you can, again, this is something that typically comes through cultural engagement processes with traditional custodians. And then some sort of framework to put it all together. So this is the one that we follow, again, at JCB. We've been developing and tweaking it for a while, but it gives us a way to actually measure ourselves in something that is typically unmeasurable. So my dream is that one day I'll have a brief, and at the start of that brief that hits my desk as part of an EOI or an RFT process, it will say, these are the values, rights and laws of the country that you're working on. This is your responsibility towards country. I would love every brief to start with that. Or that can go into planning law. I don't care, either way, I just want it to be there. Then that gives us the opportunity to marry that understanding of the values, rights and laws of country with the purpose of the project. And if they don't marry well, then maybe that project shouldn't be in that location. Maybe that project should be somewhere else. Gives us a cultural metric to understand if we're citing a project properly. If they do marry well, then the two of these then establish the project values and principles. They then determine the project outcomes, and then they project objectives, and then inspire the project outcomes. Now this is, if you ever work in public architecture or government bids, you hear project purpose, project principles and project objectives all the time, but they're never couched with the values, rights and laws of country. There isn't an Indigenous lens with which to view these objectives and understand them and interpret them. So that's something that I hope for the future, but if you ever have the opportunity to engage with traditional custodians, I encourage you to understand this up front because it will change the way that you make decisions for the project. Again, going back to the point before, what are the values driving decision making? If these values were there, they would change the way that we design. And if we do it properly, then the outcomes will meet the objectives will meet the values and principles will meet the purpose, and all of that will live the values, rights and laws of country as an active thing, not just something we can note down on a piece of paper. We'll be able to see it and feel it. Now, for some more documentation stuff. The reason, as I said at the beginning of the lecture, the national standards of competency for architecture have changed, and this will impact your registration process. It will impact what you have to prove when you go to register to be an architect. At the very beginning of the document, I encourage you to read the whole document. Actually, I really encourage you to read the explanatory notes because it's very in-depth and gives you a lot of understanding and a lot of definitions of the words and how to interpret them, particularly the cultural terms. But anyway, at the very start of this document, it says, embedded within the practice of architecture is the recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's ongoing connection and custodianship of country, and the ethical responsibilities to the physical environment and the transition to a carbon neutral built environment. These responsibilities are fundamental to architectural practice. So unfortunately, you're graduating at a time where the degree hasn't caught up yet. The curriculum will change dramatically over the next 5 years, and it's something that you're going to have to put in the time yourself to develop an understanding of. Specifically, if you go to register in the next, say, 5 to 7 years, these are the things that you'll need to develop an understanding of. So applying principles of project planning, considering the implications for country. So all of those questions that I put up on the screen before, they're all ways to tease out what are the implications for country for the projects that we're working on. Be able to implement culturally responsive and meaningful engagement processes that respect the importance of country and reciprocal relationships with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples across architectural services. That is a very long sentence. Again, you may or may not be able to engage with traditional custodians in any of the work that you are doing, but there is a lot of literature and a lot of resources out there that talk about all different forms of engagement. Some of them are quite theory-based, some of them are quite practical, and more of them will become available over the next few years. But understand that apart from like tick box consultation, which is bad, we don't do that, all other forms of consultation will be appropriate at different points in time. So there is no, this is the absolute, like, you might view partnership as the absolute ultimate wonderful thing because it's joint decision making, it's the way it's full on complete partnership with traditional custodians on a project. Not every project lends itself to that, and not every project the traditional owners will want to have that role. Sometimes it will be advising, sometimes it will be review, sometimes it will be a more lengthy and detailed engagement process. Sometimes it will be co-design. Sometimes it will be all manner of things and everything in between. But just going to traditional owners and telling them what's happening and saying, yes, we consulted, always bad. Don't do that. It's typically what happens. PC 15, comply with the legal and ethical obligations relating to legislative requirements in relation to copyright, moral rights, authorship of cultural knowledge, and intellectual property requirements across architectural services. So authorship of cultural knowledge, as I said before, you earn Aboriginal knowledge over time. You don't just have the right to know it. And it is not owned by any one individual. It is a collective knowledge that has been passed down over thousands of generations. So it cannot be transferred. You cannot relinquish your intellectual property, your cultural intellectual property of anything that's to do with Aboriginal knowledge. So if somebody tells you something, it doesn't mean you can take it and use it however you want. There is a way that it needs to be interpreted and a way that needs to be attributed and a way that it needs to be respected. So understand what that is. You can look up Terry Jenke. She has done a lot of work. She's an Aboriginal copyright lawyer. And she has done a lot of work on ICIP, Indigenous Cultural Intellectual Property, and has a lot of resources available online. 17, have an understanding of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people's aspirations to care for country and how these inform architectural design. So educate yourself with land management practices and cultural practices and ceremonial practices. Understand at least what they could be so that when you do have the opportunity to engage, you have a broad understanding of what might be the answer and the outcome. Also look at case studies of how they've informed architectural design before. Be able to undertake site, cultural and contextual analysis as part of preliminary design research. So again, this is everything that we've already talked about. Understand how to embed the knowledge, worldviews and perspectives of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples shared through engagement processes into conceptual design in a meaningful, respectful and appropriate way. I would suggest start looking up Indigenous projects, learn what the process of engagement was, and I would really encourage you to find sources where the traditional owners' voices are included or the Indigenous clients' voices are included, because if they're not there, then it's really hard to know whether the process was actually genuine and done in a way that the community wanted. 29, be able to develop and evaluate design options in terms of the heritage, cultural and community values embodied in the site and in relationship to proper project requirements. We've talked about values of site, values of country. Be able to explore options for siting a project, including integrating information and analysis of relevant cultural, social and economic factors. Straightforward. And then the last one is about communicating in culturally responsive methods. So you might hear culturally appropriate all the time, but that's sort of like a baseline. Culturally responsive is actually understanding the context that you're within and knowing how to communicate in that role, when to talk, when not to talk, when to listen, what things you should and shouldn't say. 36, be able to apply creative, it's actually the one I think is the most important. They're all important, but this one's particularly important. So be able to apply creative imagination, design precedent, emergent knowledge, critical evaluation, and continued engagement with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples to produce a coherent project design, so engagement throughout the entire process. This bit's important. This should be resolved in terms of supporting health and wellbeing outcomes for country. So everything we've talked about, every project you work on should improve the health and wellbeing of country in some way. The 45 talks about considering the impact of country and the environment in relation to the specification of materials and other standards that we might use. So this is really understanding that, you might specify blackwood timber because blackwood was a tree that was on that site, and you want to bring back the identity of that country some way through the materiality of the project. But you might only be able to get blackwood from an old growth forest, and that's not good. You might be destroying somebody else's country in the process of bringing back the identity of your own. So understanding where these materials come from and if the places that they're coming from are causing harm or if they are healthy themselves. My motto in life, question everything. All the systems that we operate within nowadays are designed by humans, therefore they can be changed by humans. So don't accept anything as a status or a standard. And thank you. That's it.